This podcast is brought to you by the kind support of the Active Share podcast. What does a two-time world-winning coach and MLB baseball team owner, top chef, and luxury fashion designer have in common? They've all been featured on the Active Share podcast. If you're seeking the less obvious and are curious about the ever-changing world and how it affects investing, the Active Share podcast is for you. Hear thought-provoking conversations with thought leaders, company executives, and William Blair Investment Management's own analysts and portfolio managers as they share unique perspectives on investing in a world that's always evolving. Download the Active Share podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, and TuneIn.
I realized early in my career that I never had the answer to the question of what do you want to be? When people said, where do you want to be in 10 years? Or I never had an appropriate answer. So what I realized instead was I needed to be able to keep the relevant doors open for me and be learning and growing constantly.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Nazmeera Moola, who is Chief Sustainability Officer of 91, based in Capetown, where she previously headed up South African investing. Welcome, Nazmeera. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with your background. Where did you grow up? What did you study?
I grew up in a slightly obscure part of the world. So I grew up in northern KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, just outside Newcastle on a dairy farm, which is obscure for most South Africans. So certainly for the average listener in the US will be very obscure.
And I always find that people who grow up on farms have a little bit more of a maybe inclination towards the world of investing, given that trading, a little bit of volatility, risk management is second nature. Did you find that?
I think there's a lot of lessons you learn in farming, watching your parents farm, that is very useful as an investor. The main one for me was perseverance. Everything doesn't always go your way, and you have to be prepared to stay the course. You have to be prepared to take a long enough view on things. And then, as you say, risk management, you end up needing to think about diversifying crops. I always say my father had to think about diversifying the number of bulls that he had, because if you only have one bull servicing your whole herd and it dies, you have a problem if you're a dairy farmer. So yes, many lessons.
And a lesson or two about volatile market circumstances, I'm sure, as well, which is probably not alien to in emerging markets.
Exactly. Dependence on the weather, dependence on so many things outside your control is something that you become familiar with as a farmer.
How did you then go to study, and what did you study, and how did you come to enter the world of investing?
So I was never sure exactly what I wanted to be when I was in high school. I knew I was good at maths, and growing up in South Africa in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was a strong impact from the racial segregation in the country. So if you were a person of color, the idea that you could just expect to enter a corporate with a fairly broad degree and make your way was not something that you had. So most of my cousins who are 10 years older than me are all lawyers, doctors, accountants, something where you could hang your shingle up and operate by yourself. For my purposes, I went to university in the mid-90s, which was just post Nelson Mandela being released and South Africa's free elections. So I was a little bit more adventuresome and decided to study actuarial science. I realized after about 2 years, this was a really bad idea because I needed the qualitative to go along with the quantitative side of my brain. And I ended up with a degree in finance and economics. And from there, my thesis supervisor was friends with the South African economist for Merrill Lynch at the time. And that's how I got my first job. And from Merrill Lynch, I moved into asset management.
And at what point did sustainable investing come onto your horizon?
I think when you cover emerging markets, the first part of sustainability, which is the ESG integration, the assessment of the externalities, is always part of your thinking. You have to think about the social issues. You have to think about the political issues that can influence the valuation of your investments. So that was always part of the background. Where this then evolved to is by 2016, former Investec Asset Management, which is now called 91, took over the management of the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund. This is funded by the governments of the UK, Sweden, Switzerland, and Holland, and has just over $1.2 billion invested in over 50 infrastructure projects on the continent. And it gives you an opportunity to invest in some amazing projects, to do some really amazing things. However, the impact reporting and the considerations that are required, given the nature of the investors, is quite high. And what that did was it made me think about how we thought about the projects we did. I mean, I remember one credit committee where the entire discussion was around the villager resettlement risks. So you start thinking quite clearly around how to ensure that the project's 30-year life is actually viable. And I think that formed the other part of sustainability to me. So having had these two extremes, where I then got to was thinking about how could you make this scalable in public markets in our big listed strategies in the middle.
It's interesting. Do you think your location in South Africa has brought that into focus more acutely? Because I've spoken to some economists down there who have done, for example, extinction accounting. Because you have so much wildlife and so many natural reserves there, where perhaps extinction of animal types has been on your mind for some time. Do you think it's a part of the natural way of how you think about any impact?
I think for me, what it's done is made me think about impact in a practical sense. You need to be pragmatic in your trade-offs. So it becomes about, we need an accelerated carbon transition, but what are the people impacts? You end up thinking about just transition, because if you go too fast, you end up leaving people behind, and this will create a socio-political backlash, which will then set you backwards. So it becomes a very pragmatic thought process. What can you do? What is sustainable? And what has long-term benefits?
And what role does a chief sustainability officer play in an asset manager like 91?
I think the term of chief sustainability officer is a new one, and everybody has a slightly different definition. So I can only give you our definition. My role is rooted in the investment team. So I have some corporate responsibilities, but the core responsibilities are in the investment team. So it's overseeing the ESG integration across the business, focusing on our strategic engagement priorities, as that has become a much bigger issue that we look at. We signed up to the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative last year, so helping set our targets around that and implement our thinking. Also directing our thinking around key advocacy points. We've become very vocal in this idea of net zero targets needing to be implemented in a way that results in, one, real world carbon reduction, but two, in a way that's equitable for emerging markets. And that's something I've been part of. And then lastly, also product development. If we're going to have a real voice in the space, the best way to do that is to be deploying money behind your advocacy points. So and designing product behind that, I think, is really important.
And given your location in emerging markets, how do you think that the ESG integration, let's say, progression has moved in emerging markets versus how well do you think ESG even is a feature for companies there and investors?
So the average emerging market is well behind Europe at this point in time. I think Europe's your leading geography on this issue, and the average emerging market country or company is well behind. But there are aspects that will show up as important in various countries. So interestingly, in South Africa, I suppose not surprisingly, diversity is a massive issue. And you see that being implemented over the last decade in quite a formal manner, where we have an employment equity forum within our business that is a legislative requirement. And the conversations that are raised from that have actually become really useful in managing human capital across the business.
And how about from the client side, the investor side? How do you see the demand changing for ESG integrated products? And how do you see the focus on the engagement and the really effective engagement that you're conducting?
So from our global investors, from our investors based in Europe or Canada or the UK, and increasingly the US, but the US is lagging behind, I think there is been a massive acceleration in demand for sustainable products that are actually more than just ESG integration. ESG integration is increasingly the entry level. It is about how do you actually, as you mentioned, have effective engagement? How do you actually start having some positive impact is what we're seeing. Within the South African context, you are seeing a growth in that, particularly in the institutional market. But the focus locally is much more around social issues and diversity than it is on climate change, whereas what we're seeing from global investors is much more on climate.
It's interesting. And in terms of product development, if you were to look forward for the next 5 years, what do you think you'll be focused on? And will all of your products, ESG integration, I think, is almost like a hygiene factor now. It's almost not optional. But as far as ESG branding or maybe impact specific, how do you see your product range developing and maybe the demand landscape changing as well?
Evan, you're exactly right. ESG integration is bare minimum. If you look at the European Union regulations that have come out, Article 6 is the ticket to play, which is ESG integration. So it is about moving beyond that. We have taken quite a conservative view around labeling funds sustainable. So we're only doing that in cases where we can clearly demonstrate the factors that we are trying to influence positively and have some ability to measure at least some of our portfolio in that respect. Article 8, some proportion, Article 9, the entire portfolio. So we've been quite careful with that. What we are, however, doing is we have a range of funds that are going to be launched over the next 12 to 18 months in the space on both the equity and the debt side around either the environment or overall sustainable equities. But what we're also looking at is how can we support the transition in emerging markets through funding on the debt side.
There's certainly been a lot of focus on emerging markets, especially at COP26, and South Africa in particular, I think, got highlighted as an area that needed perhaps some multilateral assistance in terms of getting to certain standards. So that is, it's clearly on everyone's mind in terms of equity across the board. I'd really like to go back to the point of diversity, because as you said, in South Africa, it is something that you live and breathe every day and is a key part of the national discourse. What are your thoughts on the diversity of the finance industry in particular? You mentioned perhaps your university days, not an obvious path. How do you think it's evolved since then?
The diversity certainly improved. It's not where we want it to be, but it has improved massively over the course of the last 20 years. If I look at our business, our South African management team is 6 people, of which there are 4 women of the 6, which I think is a fantastic achievement, and 4 people of color out of the 6 as well.
And in terms of taking that model to the investment management industry as a whole, do you think that there will be changes made, whether it comes from stakeholder pressure or I've seen asset owner pressure? There's a diversity charter now in the UK that's been signed, and there's been requests for asset managers to sign up and to pledge. That's actually something I used to work in US public funds that has been at the forefront of their ESG policy for some time, is allocating assets to minority owned firms. Do you see that the initiatives that you have in place at 91 are getting broader traction across the industry?
I think there's definitely a broad focus around improving diversity. If you look at the government regulatory framework, there's actually 7 categories that they look at, from ownership to management to broad-based people to supplier development, what they call enterprise development, which is development of businesses not in your supply chain, and then CSI. So there's a massive focus on that, because what we've seen from asset owners, from our clients, is they increasingly only want to deal with level 1 and 2 asset managers. So you need to score fairly high on some combination of these categories in order to do that. And what that's done is it's forced us to be innovative in how we think. In the suppliers we're trying to help develop, but also, for example, the skills development component, we have to support unemployed people. So we're now running quite a large bursary program. We have 65 students that we are sponsoring through university, of which half are doing degrees that we would potentially hire out of. But the other half, we focused on healthcare and education, because we want to increase the skills base for that in the country.
And that's just a community impact that you are contributing to.
Exactly.
It's very impressive. I think we're certainly seeing a rise in those type of apprenticeship programs in Europe. And it seems also they can address some of the skills gap as well as the shortage of labor right now. So it's kind of a win-win situation. Just going back to your personal story, have there been any setbacks or challenges along your career path so far that you've learned lessons from? And also in particular, if you could refer to having a career in an emerging market does come with, we mentioned before, some of the volatility, some of the more uncertainty. How has that perhaps formed how you think about your professional approach?
So if I think about setbacks, I think I had a fantastic start to my career at Merrill Lynch initially. And then I left to join local manager, and there was corporate action very soon after I arrived. And it was quite disconcerting because I'd realized so much of my identity had been tied up in my first employer. But what it did is it gave me some time to think about what my next move was. I made a decision at that point, which again, a few years later, I thought was the wrong decision. But looking back on it now, it wasn't the most absorbing job at the time, but it gave me more time with my daughter. So that by the time I got to joining Investec Asset Management, I was ready to fully commit and jump all in again. So things that at the time maybe you think is the wrong thing, with the fullness of hindsight, you end up understanding that it served a purpose at that point in time.
It is interesting, I think, that moment when you realize that your identity perhaps should not be tied up with your employer. And usually in finance, it happens very suddenly. And it needs to happen because once you have that break, you are almost more free to work on your own career and to look after your own career path. But it is something, unfortunate in finance, that tends to happen to us rather than something that we determine. You mentioned some of the working asset managers. Have there been any key people or mentors with you throughout your career? Or have you been mentorless? Because many of my guests have actually not had mentors.
My first boss was amazing. So my first boss was the senior South African economist for Merrill at the time. He needed an assistant. So I worked for him for 2 years before I moved with them to London to work on emerging markets. But Joss we worked in the same physical office because we were the only institutional people in the retail office that they had in Cape Town. Everybody else was in Johannesburg. So we talked constantly. And he taught at university until he was 39. So quite an academic approach. And he was massively supportive of me, but he taught me the practical economics that I know. He unfortunately passed away a long time ago. So I can't say he's been with me through my whole career, but he certainly had a massive impact on me that's long outlasted the period that I had him in my life.
Made me think of something there because you've been to London in your career in South Africa. What's your perception of how investors outside Africa in general think about investing in Africa? Do you think there's an accurate perception, or do you think that risks are perhaps misunderstood?
I think their perceived risk in some sectors is much higher than realized risk. So I think the general expectation is Africa is scary and therefore we need some massively high return. So for example, one of the funds we run is called the Africa Credit Opportunity Strategy, which has consistently over the last almost decade delivered very solid returns depending on the vintage, between 8 and 10%. But it's senior secured debt, but the average investor you talk to about it, that's not enough for Africa. And when you talk about the default rates, and actually the fund hasn't really had defaults, that is a surprise. And the next point becomes, that's great, but it's still too scary.
Yeah.
So I think there's this big bridge there. You see it on the infrastructure side as well. So Emerging Africa has been investing since 2002. It's invested in almost 80 projects right now. It's had 5 proper restructures or defaults and solid returns along the way for a very developmental fund. And that's not the expectation.
And when it comes to equity markets, the perception would be that the markets aren't liquid enough, that there are too many large stocks perhaps driving the returns. I'm not sure if they're banks in the case of South Africa, but certainly in Nigeria, they are. Is that a valid concern? Do you think that the equity markets are not liquid enough?
I think in many markets, that is a real concern. The concentration of the market is high. The liquidity in the markets is volatile. So sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. And then in some markets, you worry about currency convertibility. So those are real risks that I'm not going to walk away from. But I think one of the conclusions we've reached is we would rather invest in Africa through the debt markets than through the equity markets.
An interesting approach. Going back to some personal reflections, was there any one piece of advice that you've received throughout your career, or any creed or motto that you live by?
I think I realized early in my career that I never had the answer to the question of what do you want to be? When people said, where do you want to be in 10 years? Or I never had an appropriate answer. So what I realized instead was I needed to be able to keep the relevant doors open for me and be learning and growing constantly while still keeping options open to develop. So having several paths you can go down.
And in terms of any advice you would have for your younger self, if you're looking back at that young student studying at Capetown, would you have had anything you know now that you wish you had known then?
What I wish my younger self had known, but I think if someone had told me this, I wouldn't have been able to internalize it, is you don't have to fight every battle. That when you get the email that annoys you, don't respond. That's exactly the one you should not respond to at that point in time. Just let things flow a little bit. There's a great Asian proverb, which is, I'm going to mangle it now, but it effectively amounts to there's strength in flowing with the water than flowing against the water. And it took me years to even understand that, because I was like, but how, if you need to go the other way, how are you going to get there? And then in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, I've realized it's less about, well, for me, it's less about the river and more like an ocean metaphor. And you can use the currents to get where you're going rather than having to constantly battle against them.
Having children has taught me that in terms of picking my battles as well, and definitely not always going against the flow. Well, thank you so much, Nazmeera. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. From our first discussion of your farming background, I think what you've really brought is how fully integrated the question of sustainability has to be across our approach in finance. And it was wonderful to hear how you are doing that in so many different levels at 91. And thanks for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm Aoife David. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.